Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulina Muhammad al-Amin wa na'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining me and thank you for the invitation from the Ghamidi Center to share some of my thoughts with regard to a series of lectures that Javed Ahmed Ghamidi conducted some years ago. This session is going to be a series of short lectures that I will give, bringing to light some of the key points that are raised in a number of lectures from 2015 by Javed Ghamidi on the topic of both the traditional religious narrative within Islam and the Muslim community, as well as the counter-narrative that he offers with regard to that narrative from this period of time. Now, in order to situate myself with you all as my audience, and hopefully you'll be joining me for these lectures that come, I'm going to set a few of the ground rules and just give you a sense of how this is going to be. One, we're going to have a conversation, and my goal here is to teach you all, but to do it in a way that hopefully is accessible, where the language is not going to be too complicated or too inaccessible, but at the same time is not going to be such that you feel as though you are not getting the depth that really is conveyed in these fascinating lectures that Ghamidi Sahab conducted in 2015. By way of background, my name is Adnan Zulfiqar, which hopefully is tagged somewhere on this video. I am a professor, an associate professor of law at Rutgers University in New Jersey. I teach at the law school. My background is both with doctoral work in law, a Juris Doctor, as well as a PhD in Near Eastern Language and Civilizations from the University of Pennsylvania, where my work was on Islamic legal history in particular, and the work around collective obligations or fard kifaya. So this is my background, and this is my area of interest. My interest with regard to Ghamidi Sahab came about many years before I even started my PhD, and I won't go into much detail there, but what I've been most interested in, and the reason for me conducting these lectures and hopefully others in the future, is the type of intellectual thought and re-engagement with our intellectual tradition as Muslims that I found with Ghamidi Sahab as well as within his circle. And so to the extent that I can bring that in the English language and help those of you who are unable to access Ghamidi Sahab's work in the primary language, that's part of the objective here. At the same time, for those of you who may or may not be familiar with the Ghamidi Center and Ghamidi Sahab himself, he encourages an intellectual atmosphere, one in which criticism, critique of him, of his ideas, as well as others within the circle, is strongly encouraged as a part of the generative process through which Islamic knowledge and knowledge in general moves forward. And so during the course of this lecture, although it will be primarily about bringing to light some of the key points from the Dallas lectures on religious narrative, on the traditional and counter narrative that Ghamidi Sahab put forward, on certain occasions, I may raise questions. I may bring out certain critiques that could be useful as we progress forward in our understanding here. Let me give you a roadmap of what we're going to do, at least in the next few sessions, and particularly in this first one. So over the next few sessions, what you're going to get is a sense of where Ghamidi is coming with some of his ideas. Where are these ideas originating from in terms of why does he go down this road? And some of this I'll talk about with regard to him specifically, and some will be my own commentary. In addition to that, then we'll walk through the sort of key players within the traditional narrative that he wants us to investigate, that he feels as though have had the most profound influence on the construction of this narrative over time. And then some of the most salient points that are really at the heart of this narrative, that in order to fully appreciate the narrative and then the counter narrative that he offers, you have to really get a sense of these key salient points. In this first session, my goal is to walk us through at least the introduction to some of these ideas that we're going to discuss over this series of lectures, and to really frame it for you so that you're ready for what comes next. Okay, so that gives you a sense of where we're going to go. For Ghamidi, the idea of this narrative seems to really have originated a long time back, as he was beginning to think about Islam in sort of a scholarly manner and go through a number of different teachers and study through, his early training in Dars-e-Nizami, the sort of traditional South Asian curriculum, and through traditional learning there in a variety of different subjects with a number of different teachers. And then over time, studying under people like Maulana Maududi, who we'll certainly be discussing in these lectures, Amin and Islahi, who is probably his most prominent teacher, and others. This narrative also is influenced by what he was seeing around him in his society in Pakistan, where he lived for the majority of his life, was born there and lived there, what he was seeing around there, and then what he began to see in other parts of the world as well. And what it seems to be his own desire to at least respond to other people's questions as to what is going on. This question of what is going on has been on the tips of the tongues of Muslim scholars and, frankly, non-Muslims for many decades now, as they've tried to understand, at least the ones who are approaching this in a positive, constructive way, is trying to understand what precisely is going on within the larger Muslim community and the dynamics that are taking shape there. Now, those dynamics are heavily influenced, obviously, by what has happened over the course of a number of centuries. One of the most prominent things to bear in mind is that, and that underlies sort of some of what Ghamidi is speaking about within the traditional narrative, is that for the vast majority of Islamic history, Muslims retained a level of political power. That political power meant that for many, many centuries, and especially the centuries within which their intellectual tradition develops, they had control over their polity. They had political control over their polity. In other words, they were not in a subjugated state. In fact, they had such a dominance, Islamic civilization did for a while, and the various empires that came within it, that they couldn't imagine what it would mean to actually be subjugated. Why is that important? That's important because the traditional narrative gets constructed in a period of time. The vast majority of that traditional narrative gets constructed in a period of time where Muslims have hegemonic control over the territories in which they exist, where they are essentially functioning as a superpower. And part of the story of Islamic civilization, as we try to understand it in the modern period, is that that control and that power took a sharp turn with the entry of colonial powers, Western colonial powers, in Muslim lands. Not only did that end up representing a disjuncture, a disruption with regard to the way Islamic civilization had existed prior to that, in terms of its institutions, in terms of its governing structures, even in terms of its intellectual thought. But in addition to that, it represented a profound loss, a profound sense of loss over Islamic heritage. That has then come to define, in many respects, the period during colonialism and especially after. As Muslims have tried to understand, or rather re-understand, their relationship with the world, their relationship with governing structures, their relationship with each other, their relationship with non-Muslims, and their relationship with their faith. That's the dynamic within which all these narratives are being created, but especially this traditional narrative. Now, at the heart of this discussion that Ghamidi raises up is the question that I've kind of hinted at. What should Muslims' approach today be to their faith? What is the perspective, vision that they should have for it? And more specifically, for our purposes here, the narrative that we are speaking about, that Ghamidi Sahib is commenting on, is a narrative that relates to religion's relationship with the state. The key question that is animating the construction of this narrative and then the counter-narrative is what precisely should this relationship be? And when we say state here, it doesn't necessarily mean the nation state, although that is precisely what it means in the modern period. But historically, it's the relationship with governance and political power. Right? What is the relationship between religion and political power? Now, he takes us within this initial lecture that he gives, the first lecture in the series of 16 lectures, total lectures in the Dallas sort of series. He takes us in the first one and he asks this question. He said, all right, why is it that I felt the need to address this topic? And for him, the reason is very similar to many of these questions that policymakers are asking, that other Muslim scholars are asking, and that the average lay Muslim is asking. And it's a real question. And that is that in this modern period, we are seeing Islam represented in particular ways, and if we're frank about them, many of them are quite violent. We are seeing destructive tendencies within Muslim societies and in their relationships with external societies. And for Ghamidi, there's a particular religious approach and perspective that has become the cause for him of a lot of this distress that we're seeing within the Muslim world and among Muslims. And he says that this perspective, its consequences, are what we are seeing around us that we're concerned about. Where the sanctity of life is not quite respected the way it should be, the way that instinctually we feel as though the religion of Islam tells us it should be. That religious differences, differences of perspective or approach, become the cause of, at least one of the causes of, sort of violent interactions within the Muslim community, the cause of disunity, but even more than that, deep, deep division, deep sort of intellectual division and hardened polarization within the community. And much of it then manifests in violent ways, which is why a sense of urgency exists in trying to address it. Now, before I continue, let me be clear, so there's no confusion. Ghamidi Saab is not saying that this religious narrative is the only cause of all these issues. Let me repeat. He is not saying that the religious narrative, that the traditional religious narrative is the only cause of all these issues that we are seeing. He is certainly well aware and articulates the role of colonialism, the role of foreign interventions, the role of economics, and a series of other factors that are always at stake in some of these geopolitics that we see around the world, whether they involve Muslim countries or not. So he recognizes that. What he is simply saying is that this traditional narrative and really the mindset that it has created, which is a result of sort of centuries of intellectual thought that then didn't fully adapt to these disruptive things that happened in the world, especially with the loss of Muslim political power, that this narrative and the mindset it creates is a significant cause within the behavior that we're seeing, or of the behavior that we're seeing. And he points in particular to two places in the world to give us a sense of this. He begins by saying, look, I'm not new to this game. This isn't something new that I'm introducing onto the scene. I had pointed this out, he says, when Afghanistan first went down a particular path. So, for those of you who don't know Afghan history, I'm not going to give you a full primer on it, but some decades ago, the Soviets tried, and unsuccessfully, to occupy Afghanistan and to sort of create their government there that was particularly wedded to ideas around communism. And they were able to install one for a period of time, but then there was a response. And we sort of won't go into the dynamics of that and where sort of different countries situated themselves. But within that, the narrative, the traditional narrative became incredibly useful. Because the traditional narrative essentially allowed jihad to be unlocked. That you were able to push the idea, especially in Afghanistan, of a transnational jihad to root out these foreign occupiers. But the manner in which it was done and what it unleashed, we are still contending with today. And sadly, and there's plenty of blame to go around, it has resulted in where Afghanistan is left, the position that it is left in today. The other area that he points to, as again, somewhat of a warning of what's to come, is that he notes whatever we have seen in Afghanistan, that is going to be just scratching the surface of what we are potentially about to see in the Middle East and Levant. With the rise of the Islamic State and the kind of factionalism and violence that has existed in that space, the potential influence of that on the generation to come is something that is of deep concern to him. Okay. Within this, then, I've noted this idea of jihad, which we're going to come back to because it's important. It's part of sort of the manifestation of some of this narrative. And what Ghamidi points out is what we are seeing that should concern us is that there is an appeal with regard to this narrative that then gets connected to sort of committing certain types of violence. There's an appeal that stretches across the Muslim world, such that even in places as far afield from Syria and Iraq as Malaysia, people are signing up and ready to go fight jihad, to answer that call. And why are they doing that? They are doing that with the anticipation that the jihad that they are fighting is the jihad that is spoken of in the Quran, and that the narrative and mindset that they have been given is that jihad that they're going to fight will lead to the same types of rewards that the jihad in the Quran speaks of, the particular type of jihad in the Quran. That paradise will be the result of this effort that they're going to engage in. And for Ghamidi, the issue is not so much the idea of jihad itself. He's not a pacifist as such. But it is the exploitation and misuse of parts of a finely tuned Islamic tradition for other objectives today. In some respects, that is part of his underlying critique. That God, he says, or his notion is that God has set out a particular scheme with regard to everything within the faith, including the idea of potentially fighting for the faith, for God. And God has put it together with a certain wisdom, with particular restraints, with certain preconditions. And that when those are sidestepped and ignored, that this is when the problems get created. And his overarching critique is really that it is this fundamental misconstruing of the Islamic heritage, or of the message of, really, not so much the Islamic heritage, but the message of the Quran and the Sunnah, that has created some of the issues we see today. Why is all this important? Why is it important for us to have a discussion about the traditional religious narrative? For Ghamidi, you cannot begin to fix what you think is wrong today without understanding how you got here. It is not possible to change or reform a particular understanding of religion's relationship with the state until you have a full understanding of what the traditional conception of that relationship is, which is the basis upon which those who are pontificating on it today rest. That is essential. You need to know what precisely you are hoping to critique. And here we get an insight into Ghamdi's approach in general. He does not shy away from intellectual disagreement, but more importantly, he insists that you first take the time to understand the other perspective fully and on as sort of in as much clarity and on their terms as much as possible. Because you cannot create a counter narrative until you actually try to respect what the narrative is in the first place, respect it enough to understand it. You don't have to agree with it. Certainly you can disagree with it. But first you have to know what it is before you begin to disagree. So that's where we're at. That is the beginning of this little journey that we'll go on, and that hopefully you're going to learn from, I'll learn from, as I try to walk you through what Javed Ghamidi has done, which is to unpack the traditional narrative so that we can see what's inside, and then subsequent to that, offer us something else to chew on, to think on as a counter narrative. Look forward to continuing this conversation. Wa akhiru da'wa walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.